common problem in most people's writing is problems with sentence errors. And in order to understand sentence errors, you have to understand clauses and how clauses affect sentences. Clauses are groups of related words that include a subject and a verb, or a subject and a predicate. Okay, there are two types of clauses. An independent clause is a complete thought and can stand on its own. So, we went to the movies. We have a subject, we, and the predicate is went to the movies. Went is our action. A dependent clause is introduced by a word that prevents it from being a complete thought. So if you see something that says, after we went to the movies, the reader is left asking, and? So that after indicates that there should be more to the story. We connect clauses with conjunctions. Now, we have coordinating conjunctions, our fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so, and they will connect independent clauses with the same level of importance. So, we went to the movie, but the movie was terrible. Notice that we went to the movie can be a sentence, and the movie was terrible can be a sentence on its own. We connect them with a comma and then the coordinating conjunction. Okay. Dependent clauses depends on that independent clause to make it complete. Okay, so if you see something, and dependent clauses can either come before or after the independent clause. Okay, but we have to have that independent clause. So, after we went to the movies, we stopped for a cup of coffee. Notice if we just stopped it after we went to the movies, it really doesn't make any sense because we're still wanting to know more. Notice we stopped for a cup of coffee can stand on its own. That's our independent clause. Notice also that we stopped it for a cup of coffee after we went to the movies. Again, we have that dependent clause. It's coming after the independent clause. Notice that the dependent clause, when it comes before the independent clause, requires a comma. If it comes after the independent clause, there is no comma. Subordinating conjunctions like although, because, if, since, whether, while, all those can introduce a dependent clause. And the dependent clause is, because of this, is sometimes known as a subordinate clause. Subordinating conjunctions usually tell when, where, why, or under what circumstances. So, George was late for class. Why was George late for class? Because, there's our subordinating conjunction, there was a car accident that slowed traffic. Notice that without the because, there was a car accident that slowed traffic could stand on its own. But because we put that because in that subordinating conjunction, it becomes a dependent clause. A sentence fragment is just part of a sentence and it's not complete. And sentence fragments often are created when you have a dependent clause that does not have its independent clause to complete it. So, although Theo and Magenta decided to have a coffee before class, notice that although indicates a need for an independent clause, but where is it? It's not there. Sometimes compound predicates, and that means the action part of the sentence, with a single subject, confuse the issue. So if I say, since I decided not to watch the Super Bowl and watch Star Wars Marathon instead. Now, our since indicates there is a dependent clause. Okay, the subject of this clause is I. But I takes two verbs, decided and watched. And this is very long, but we still do not have a complete sentence. Okay, even though we have two actions, we still, the question is, what happened, right? we have the compound predicate. It makes both the verb phrases part of the same clause. Okay? Without an independent clause, still a sentence fragment. So be careful. There are several ways to fix a sentence fragment caused by a dependent clause. And how you do it depends on what you want to say and how you want to say it. You can take out the subordinate conjunction and make the phrase the sentence. So whenever we think about summer is a dependent clause, in order to make it to avoid the sentence fragment, we can just take out the whenever and make it an independent thought, an independent clause. Okay, we can add an independent clause. Whenever we think about summer, we think about cookouts. Okay, so we have a dependent clause and we add the independent clause. We can write the entire sentence to make it a complete thought. So thinking about summer reminds us of cookouts. In this sentence, thinking about summer is our subject, reminds is our action verb, and us is the direct object. Remember our sentence patterns from a previous presentation. Incomplete sentences are usually missing a vital component, either a subject or a predicate, either something or what it does. Okay, so these days going through so many difficulties. Okay, this lacks a subject. What are we talking about? Okay. The idea of independence in everyone's mind. And here it's like we're lacking our verb. Okay? So in order to fix the first sentence, we need a subject. So what do we put in? Teenagers these days go through so many difficulties. Okay? That's one way of completing the sentence. In the second sentence, you can just put the verb is in. The idea of independence is on everyone's mind, or in everyone's mind. The more complex a sentence is, the more important it is to make sure that all the parts are there. Now, we have one side of the sentence error scale, and that's sentence fragments. The other side is run-on sentences. Now, run-on sentences occur when the writer strings together independent clauses without proper punctuation or coordination. So, Danny watched the Super Bowl. He got excited. His team was winning. He shouted and danced around the living room. So how many independent clauses are in the sentence? There's 4. Okay, count them. Danny watched the Super Bowl. He got excited. His team was winning. He shouted and danced around the living room. That's 4 independent clauses. Sometimes people will put in commas. They'll notice that they'll recognize that it's an independent clause, so they'll throw a comma in, but that's not good enough. That results in a comma splice. The comma cannot hold those 2 independent clauses together on its own. It is not strong enough. So, how do we fix run-on sentences? Okay, there's several ways to do this, to fix run-ons and comma splices. And again, it depends upon how you want to present your information to the reader. So we can break the independent clauses into separate sentences. Danny watched the Super Bowl. He got excited. His team was winning. He shouted and danced around the living room. And that is perfectly okay grammatically, but it gets to be very monotonous reading it. A coordinating conjunction can also be inserted. So Danny watched the Super Bowl, comma, and he got excited. Period. His team was winning, comma, so he shouted and danced around the living room. Notice how we use coordination to avoid the errors in the run-on sentences. Independent clauses that have very closely related meaning can be joined with a semicolon. So, Danny watched the Super Bowl, semicolon, he got excited. His team was winning, semicolon, he shouted and danced around the living room. Don't do this too often. Again, they have to be closely related. Independent clauses can also be made into dependent clauses. Okay, just make sure you connect it with that independent clause for it to lean on. So, Danny watched the Super Bowl. Period. He got excited because his team was winning. Period. He shouted and danced around the room. Okay, again, we can even write it differently. As Danny watched the Super Bowl, comma, he got excited. He shouted and danced around the living room because his team was winning. Notice that the first sentence, the dependent clause is before the independent clause, and in the second sentence, the dependent clause follows the independent clause.